This video is brought to you by Change Over Time, since we don't have any sponsors yet. Over the years, the softwood lumber industry has been a significant income generator for the Canadian economy. Regardless of what the name of this channel says, in this case, it was not a change over time. 1/10 of all forests in the world are in Canada, so it makes sense that the softwood lumber industry is an essential sector in the Canadian economy. However, Canada exports more computers and cars than it does trees. It actually imports billions of dollars of refined wood products like crates, baskets, fiberboard, plywood, doors, and impregnated wood. You know, the kind that is stronger, more resilient to water, and cracks less because of all the chemicals that it's treated with. Softwood is wood from gymnosperm. The term gymnosperm comes from the Greek composite, literally translating to naked seeds. 90% of the forest areas in Canada are crown land, which means they are owned by the federal or usually the provincial governments and are leased out to forest companies. Stumpage is the price a company pays for the right to harvest timber from some land. In the past, the price was based on the number of trees harvested or per stump. Harvesting is managed through long-term contracts called tenures. The heart of the US-Canada lumber dispute is the claim that the Canadian lumber industry is unfairly subsidized by the federal and provincial governments. Canada can produce lumber in larger quantities at a lower price, partially due to receiving subsidies from the government. A subsidy is a form of financial aid or support extended to an economic sector, generally by the government. In the US, the lumber prices are arrived at by the workings of the invisible hand. The invisible hand is a metaphor for unseen forces that move the free market economy. In other words, this approach holds that the market will find its equilibrium without government or other interventions forcing it into unnatural patterns, meaning that in the US, demand intersects with supply to arrive at the stumpage fee. In contrast to Canada, 70% of the forests in the United States are privately owned. Wood from the private sector is sold on the open market through various buyer-seller agreements. Stumpage fees are determined through competitive auctions. That is to say, fees charged to harvest timber in the US are dictated by the market rather than the law. Canadian stumpage fees, based on labor, transportation costs, and government subsidies, being significantly lower than timber acquisition costs in the United States, was the spark that ignited the softwood lumber dispute. According to the United States, lumber production in Canada is unfairly subsidized, and if Canada wants to export lumber to the United States, they should be subjected to US trade remedy laws. US trade remedy laws state that in case a foreign country is benefiting from subsidies, they can be subjected to countervailing duties to offset the subsidy it got to bring the prices of the commodity back up to the market rates. Countervailing duties, also known as anti-subsidy duties, are trade import duties imposed under the World Trade Organization rules to neutralize the harmful effects of subsidies. In other words, because of the subsidy, Canada can produce lumber at a cheaper rate, but because of the countervailing duties that Canada has to pay when exporting, the costs increase. The goal of countervailing duties is to set a level playing field. These duties are imposed after an investigation finds that a foreign country subsidizes its export, injuring domestic producers in the importing country. Countervailing duties in the United States are assessed by the International Trade Administration of the United States Department of Commerce. The ITA determines whether imports in question are being subsidized and if so, by how much. If it is determined that such subsidies are causing material injury, that is to say, negatively impacting the domestic industry, the Department of Commerce will instruct the US Customs and Border Protection to levy duties in the amount equivalent to subsidy margins. So the US states Canada has an unfair advantage because they can produce at lower rates as they can get subsidies, while the Canadian government and lumber industry say that they don't. According to Canada, the US cannot possibly say that they are getting subsidized because, as told by Canada, Canadian timber is provided to a wide range of industries, so the lack of specificity makes it ineligible to be considered a subsidy under US law. This dispute has been going on for almost half a century, so let's give the timeline the time it deserves by summarizing it in under 2 minutes. US Lumber petitions the Department of Commerce. The United States International Trade Commission believed that these Canadian imports did, in fact, hinder US producers, but US Lumber chose not to appeal. Then, after a few years, with their cool, calm, collected, and stable government agency persona, the Department of Commerce changed their mind and put a 15% tax on Canada's wood. Canada and the United States signed a 5-year agreement, but the agreement said Canada could export only 14.7 billion board feet, that's around 34 million cubic meters per year. To make sense of these numbers in terms of the most overused ways to visualize them, the limited export is 13,600 Olympic swimming pools, which is 1,600 less swimming pools than the usual amount Canada sends annually. Everything was all peachy between the two until the agreement expired, and the two countries were unable to agree on a replacement. The Department of Commerce decided that they would make the first move, so they slapped on subsidy and anti-dumping rates, totaling a 27.22% import tax on Canadian tree goodness. In economics, especially in the context of international trade, dumping is a kind of enduring pricing. It occurs when manufacturers in country A exports a product to country B at a price lower than the market price in country B. The objective of manufacturers in country A is to increase market share in country B by driving out competition and thereby create a monopoly situation where country A exporters can unilaterally dictate price and quality of the product. And with that, back to the story you clicked on this video for. Canada complained to the WTO. In response, the WTO agreed that the DOC, quote, acted inconsistently, end quote, and had miscalculated the duties. Since complaining to the WTO wasn't enough, they also complained to NAFTA, the team behind the North American Free Trade Agreement, who unanimously agreed that the United States wasn't playing fair. The US responded in the responsible tone we have all come to expect by sticking their fingers in their ears and saying, "Not listening." Canada came out with a new agreement idea that said, "Dear US of A, please pay us 4 out of the 5.3 billion we lost thanks to being in the penalty box. Sorry for the trouble, eh?" Even though this might sound like a good idea, Elliot Feldman, an international and economic law specialist at the firm Baker & Hostetler in Washington, D.C., formerly the director of Canadian American Business Council, said that it was a one-sided bad deal for Canada. The US paid up and asked for a counseling session to be arbitrated in the London Court of International Arbitration, for short, the LCIA. After attending their first and second counseling sessions, LCIA told Canada that they did not correctly count the wood they sent to the United States and to pay the United States $69 million and to count it all again for good measure. Fast forward a few years and the Trump administration said that they will impose duties of 24% on Canadian lumber. In response, the Canadian federal government said it was thinking of banning US coal from being exported through Canadian ports and imposing a retaliatory tariff on lumber exports from the US, with an official statement that it was unfair, unwarranted, and troubling. If you don't want to end up representing a country in an international court of arbitration and get told that you didn't correctly count how many pieces of wood you sent to another country, and you don't want to get a dish of reality handed down by the WTO telling you that you miscalculated how much another country should pay in taxes, you should subscribe to our channel. I know you were expecting a sponsor here, but since we don't have any yet, when we do, your patience will pay off. Okay, bye.